We're going to go in chronological order, so we'll start with the case of Marta Gar. Marta Gar lived in a place called Artigas in 16th century France. He was married to a woman named Bertrand de Rolls. 7 months after the birth of their first child, Martin stole a small quantity of grain from his father. Out of both shame and fear for the consequences, he fled town, leaving his wife and family behind. They did not hear from him until 8 years later, when a man arrived in town claiming to be the long-lost Martin Guerre. At first, Bertrand was unsure whether to accept the man's claims that he was her husband, until he recounted to her the words that they had spoken to each other on the night of their marriage, and reminded her of a pair of white trousers he had left in a coffer on the day of his departure. Similarly, when the alleged Martin was reunited with his family and the other villagers, many were hesitant to accept him, although he greeted each person by name without introduction. He won their trust by recounting to each of them details of shared memories from the past. How could this man not be Martin? Bertrand accepted this man as her long-lost husband and lived with him as a devoted wife, even giving birth to two of his children, one of which survived. He was welcomed with open arms and took his place in the family and village life, living as Martin Guerre for more than 3 happy years. Then the trouble started. In January 1559, Bertrand de Rolls presented herself as a plaintiff before the judge at Rieux, claiming that the man with whom she had been living as her husband for the past 3 years was in fact not Martin Guerre, but a man called Arnaud Dutil, who was also known as Poncet. The case was not brought by Bertrand of her own volition. She had been pressured into it by Pierre Guerre, patriarch of the Guerre family, and Martin's uncle, who was also married to Bertrand's mother. The relationship between the fake Martin and his uncle had broken down when the impostor demanded his share of the family business for the years of Martin's absence. When he threatened to sue his uncle, Pierre then tried to kill him. Pierre and his sons had beaten Bertrand's husband within an inch of his life, and only Bertrand's throwing herself across his body to absorb the blows saved him from death. So began the arduous trial that would culminate in the decision of the court of Toulouse in September 1560. Over the course of the trial, it emerged that the cobbler who made shoes for Martin testified that the defendant was fitted for shoes 3 sizes smaller. Another witness also testified that the accused seemed to have no skill in or understanding of fencing, despite Martin being adept at the art. There was also general agreement among the witnesses that Martin Guerre was both taller and darker than the defendant, thinner in build, where the accused was stocky, with a flatter nose and a scar on his right eyebrow that the accused did not have. Perhaps even more compellingly, 2 soldiers declared the accused to be a fraud, as they had fought at Saint-Quentin with Martin Guerre, where he had lost his leg to a cannonball and had it replaced with a wooden one. On the 12th of September 1560, the court ruled that the man calling himself Martin Guerre was in fact an impostor, and in reparation for his crimes he was condemned to death and his body afterwards to be burned. So, on the 16th of September 1560, Arnaud Dutil was led through the streets of Artigas with a noose around his neck, before being taken to the house of Marta Gar, where a gallows had been built for the execution. On the very steps of his gallows, Poncet revealed his deception. Returning from Picardy 7 years earlier, some close friends of Marta Gar had mistaken Arnaud for Martin, and so, having somewhat of a reputation as a trickster and being himself in great personal debt, Arnaud decided to play along and deceive the men, obtaining information from them about Martin's life, which he used to assume his identity. After these revelations, Arnaud was executed, but this does not explain how he was able to recognize the Artigas villagers on site and knew personal details of their lives without having ever met them. Did Bertrand help Arnaud by giving him this information? It is entirely possible that Bertrand knew from the very beginning that the man calling himself Martin was not her husband. As an abandoned wife with a young son to raise, the return of her husband after so many years would have been nothing short of a miracle. To protect her family and her honor, Bertrand may have chosen to help Arnaud become Martin. She fiercely defended his identity as her husband, proclaiming that if anyone were so mad as to say the contrary, she would have him killed. And the melodrama doesn't end there. The real Marta Gar reappeared during the course of the trial. Apparently, he had been living in a monastery. The reason for his return at the time of the trial is unknown. Initially, he rejected his wife's apologies, maintaining that she should have known better than to take up with another man. Details of what happened in their relationship subsequently are not known. The second case is the Titchborne claimant. I'm using several sources here, but mostly this one by Christopher Kent. Roger Tichborne, heir to his family's fortunes and title, he would have become the 11th baronet and inherited land in Hampshire and properties in London. He was presumed to have died in a shipwreck off the coast of Brazil in 1854 at the age of 25. Sir Roger's father died in 1862, whereupon the inheritance that would have been his passed to his reckless younger brother, who managed to spend himself twice into bankruptcy before dying in February 1866. Passing the baronetcy to a posthumous son who would be born that summer. His mother, Lady Titchborne, had never reconciled herself to her eldest son's presumed death. Fortified by the assurances of a clairvoyant who said he was still alive, she advertised in the agony column of the Times and contacted a missing persons agency. In due course, a claimant appeared, and so on Christmas Day 1866, a man arrived in London who claimed to be Sir Roger Tichborne. Of all places, he hailed from the wild and distant Australian outback. Some of the more snobbish commentators characterized him as fat, uncouth, ill-spoken, and quintessentially a vulgar ex-butcher from Wagga Wagga. Lady Titchborne quickly acknowledged the claimant as her son. Also quick to recognise him were most of the Tichborne estate's tenants, old family servants, Roger's old doctor, his old lawyer, and a large number of men from the regiment in which he had been an officer. Equally quick to repudiate him were almost all of his relatives and several priests. But the claimant said he was rescued by a ship bound for Australia, and when he got there, he decided to stay. These years in Australia were particularly opaque or confused. The claimant said he moved about doing various jobs under the name of Thomas Castro. Verifying or disproving this story was equally impossible. Australia had only just ceased to be a convict colony, and by the mid-1850s was in the midst of a gold rush. It was thronged with people who wanted to keep their identities hidden. Roger Tichborne spent his first 16 years in France, but the claimant knew no French. He said he had forgotten it all. He was questioned about details of his life in France. He had forgotten most of that too. Roger was sent to Stonyhurst, the exclusive Roman Catholic public school for the classical education befitting an English gentleman. but the claimant couldn't tell Latin from Greek. More reasonably, he couldn't remember much about the army, where Roger had spent a great deal of his time drinking. Relentlessly cross-examined during the first trial, the claimant demonstrated what his opponents called an impossible ignorance about the life he laid claim to. Among those who had known Roger Tichborne, his doctor, his lawyer, his servants, he triggered recollection and confident identification, not least by his memory of small details that surely only Roger himself could have known. The claimant won acknowledgement among the Hampshire gentry by his gentlemanly skills. He was a crack shot, a good judge of horseflesh, and an expert dry fly fisherman. He was a slender young man of 24 when last seen in England. The claimant was the right height, his hair was the right colour, and there is a distinct resemblance between photographs of the claimant and that of Roger, despite the difference of a dozen years and some £200. The family claimed that Roger had a tattoo on his arm. The claimant did not, but their recollection of the tattoo came at a suspiciously late date in the proceedings and smacks of collusion. The claimant, on the other hand, had a birthmark and an unusual genital malformation, both of which he said Lady Titchborn had seen to confirm her identification of him. The claimant's opponents dismissed her identification as the foolish behaviour of a gullible old woman, so eager to believe in the survival of her son that she was an easy victim. Of course, there is an alternative interpretation that she was in tacit collusion with the claimant, acknowledging him even while knowing he was not her son, as a means of getting back at the family that she had always had problems with. The Titchborn family's rejection of the claimant could equally be read as being motivated by money. They were not interested in handing over money and power to this interloper. Unfortunately for the claimant, he lost his strongest supporter, Lady Titchborn, little more than a year after his arrival in England. With her death, he also lost the allowance on which he was living, having no personal means. Fortunately, a group of the Hampshire gentry who believed in him stepped forward with financial support. The first court case was a civil action to establish the legitimacy of his claim. This he essentially lost. It was followed by the criminal trial of the claimant for perjury for testifying under oath that he was Sir Roger. He was found guilty in February 1874 and received the exceptionally harsh sentence of 14 years in prison. These were two huge trials, followed eagerly by the public. It was like the O.J. Simpson trial of the 19th century. Class rather than race being a key focus of the trial. The case called into question the legitimacy of the landed gentry and highlighted the excesses of this social class. So much for the notion of the gentleman. Every blue blood in this story seems to be drinking or gambling or whoring themselves to death. And that's when they're not fighting with their families, sleeping with their cousins, or getting lost at sea. Most critics say that the interloper was a fraud, but some, such as Douglas Woodruff, suggest that the evidence is slightly in favour of the claimant. Thanks to the prison diet and no alcohol, the claimant finally emerged from prison on parole in 1884, a trim and somewhat graying, rather distinguished looking figure, certainly much closer to the establishment norm for a gentleman than when he was fighting the case. And the public had still not forgotten Sir Roger. He signed up with a booking agent and played the music halls, appealing to that court of popular knowingness to decide whether he was a self-made or self-unmade gentleman. Case 3, the Chameleon. Frédéric Pierre Bourdin, born the 13th of June 1974, is a French serial imposter that the press has nicknamed the Chameleon. He began his impersonations as a child and claims to have assumed at least 500 false identities, 3 being teenage missing people. Born in Nanterre, Bourdin was raised by his grandparents in Nantes until he ran away and eventually went to Paris. He never knew his father. He would later state that his various frauds and impersonations were an attempt to get the attention and affection that he never had as a child. His most infamous fraud was arguably in 1997 when Bourdin pretended to be missing American teenager Nicholas Barkley. This case is the focus of the great 2012 documentary The Imposter. Nicholas Barkley was aged 13 when he went missing from his hometown of San Antonio, Texas on the 13th of June 1994. In 1997, Bourdin was 22 or 23 years old. He was in Spain at a youth shelter where he was pretending to be a homeless teenager. Steve McQueen was 27 when he played a teenager in The Blob. Bourdin was already pushing it at 22. Just imagine the commitment to the deception to get away with this. Or maybe it was just simple desperation. Bourdin was maybe homeless already. If he pretended to be underage, then he would get better treatment. Bourdin told Spanish authorities that he was an American named Nicholas Barkley. He fooled them. They would maybe have only known that he was not Spanish. As far as being American, etc., maybe they were easily duped. In October of 1997, the Spanish authorities called their counterparts in the US to say that they had Barkley at a youth shelter. Playing the part of Barkley, Bourdin claimed to have been kidnapped by someone in the military and forced into human trafficking in Europe. So Bourdin, he was basically preying on people's fears related to missing children and human trafficking. He was eventually flown to the United States. Although Bourdin had brown eyes and a French accent, he convinced the family he was their blue-eyed son, saying he had escaped from a child prostitution ring and that people in Europe had altered his eye color. Bourdin lived with the family for almost 5 months until the 6th of March 1998. In late 1997, a local private investigator grew suspicious while he was working with a TV crew that had been filming the family. The investigator compared a photo of Bourdin's ears to Nicholas's ears and discovered that they did not match. In February 1998, the FBI obtained a court order to take the young man's fingerprints and DNA, which were later identified as belonging to Bourdin. In September 1998, Bourdin pleaded guilty to passport fraud and perjury in a San Antonio federal court. He was imprisoned for 6 years, more than twice as long as recommended by the sentencing guidelines. When Bourdin was returned to France from the US in 2003, he was moved to Grenoble and assumed the identity of Leo Ballet, a 14-year-old French boy who had been missing since 1996. DNA testing proved he was not Ballet. In August 2004, he was in Spain, claiming to be an adolescent named Ruben Sanchez Espinosa, whose mother had been killed in the Madrid bomb attacks. When the police found out the truth, they deported him to France. In June 2005, Bourdin passed himself off as Francisco Hernandez Fernandez, a 15-year-old Spanish orphan, and spent a month in the Collège Jean Monnet, a junior high school in Pau, France. He claimed that his parents had been killed in a car accident. He dressed as a teenager, adopted a proper walking style, covered his receding hairline with a baseball cap, and used depilatory face creams. On the 12th of June, an administrator from his school unmasked him after seeing a television program about his exploits. On the 16th of September, he was sentenced to 4 months in prison for possessing and using the previous false identity of Leo Ballet. With Bourdin, he's not just a con man, it's a real pathology. But I think in recent years he got married. The marriage didn't last, but as of recently, I believe he's kind of on the straight and narrow, no more impostering.